Welcome to Hollywood Changemakers, a podcast by entertainment industry professionals who love to talk about the issues that impact our culture and our faith. This is Hollywood Changemakers. Hello, I'm Karen Covell. Welcome to our podcast, The Hollywood Changemakers. I am very excited today to have you meet a dear friend of mine, not only part of my family in Hollywood, but part of my personal family, Caleb Monroe. Caleb is a writer, excellent writer of graphic novels and short stories and screenplays, but he's also a hybrid. He also works at a church in Hollywood. And a lot of Christians really don't quite get how you can be a Christian working in a church and a professional, creative professional in the Hollywood entertainment industry. So you're going to meet both in one person today. I am so glad to introduce you to Caleb Monroe. Hi, Caleb.
Hi, Karen. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad too. I'm excited today to talk about our topic, artists and the church. And before we start, I just want you to lay out how you want us to start the foundation of the conversation.
Yes. So when we talk about artists in the church, those words are words that mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I thought we could just first, I'm going to start by saying I am pro-artist and I am pro-church. Obviously, I do both because we tend to be side takers as human beings, just in general. And then I want to say when we talk about the church, I'm talking primarily from inside the North American Protestant church. I may make some observations about other streams of Christianity or friends and conversations I've had, but primarily we're talking North American Protestant church. And by artist, we're going to mostly focus on those who will or do make their living in an artistic profession.
We don't want to discourage the creative people who don't make money at it. They're still creative. Mm-hmm. And yet we want to focus on the ones who have given it as their career, their vocation. They are focusing on this to make a living using the gifts and talents that God has given them for that. So.
And it creates a different relational context to the church. Mm-hmm. Whether the church is relating to a propensity or a way you're wired, or they're relating to your job, and those are just different contexts and they bring up different things. So, yeah.
Now, I grew up in a home where my parents were both from the arts, very supportive of the arts, thrilled that their children were going into the arts. And it never hit me until I actually got to college that most of the people I met, their parents either did not have any clue why they were going into the arts or were actually very against them going into the arts. Mm-hmm. And some of the reasons were they thought they were just following their ego. They thought they were just getting over some childish, playful hobby that they need to now be serious in life and get a real job. Or they just didn't understand how in the world you make a living at being creative. So from someone in the church, a leader in the church, and a creative writer, have you experienced that tug?
I've been very blessed in that my experience was much like yours because my mom is an author. So when I said, hey, I want to be a writer when I grow up, my parents said, okay, because that's what one of them did for a job. And so I also was very blessed. And it did take me a while before I got around a lot of other Christian artists to understand how unusual that had been or how rare. Because, when you're 11, you're like, well, this is just how life is, right? But yeah.
Exactly. And what are some of your encounters with artists who are struggling with trying to embrace the church, but not feeling love and support from the church?
Well, I think I'm going to start by talking about sort of where I think the disconnect begins.
Great.
Okay.
Great.
And then talk about how that's experienced by those in the church who are not artists and how that's experienced by those in the church who are artists.
That's fair. Mine was kind of a loaded question, wasn't it? Yes. Let's start at the beginning.
Yes. And so I think at the root of this problem, at the root of this disconnect, is actually two good things. Sometimes they get twisted or they get exaggerated or they get filtered through a lot of sinful inclinations. But I think all cultures require two things. And that is a preserving force, like an immune system, and a progressive force, like a growth hormone. And institutions tend to be the preservative force. Do you remember? This is who we are and our culture. This is our history. And that keeps you from being completely disconnected from the past. And then the progressive elements, of which artists are a prominent part, but so are like inventors and technologists and what have you, are saying, yes, but here's where we can go from there, right? And so you have this inclination towards progress and this inclination towards preservation, and they're both good. Because if you take away one, the culture collapses. If you take away preservation, then the culture vanishes.
You lose anything you've learned through history or through time, and
Yes.
you just keep moving forward without looking back.
Yes. There was a Greek general who about 100, I think it was 100 or 200 years after the fall of the Assyrian Empire, was passing through that area and came across these enormous ruins, because Assyria had been a huge empire and they lasted like 9 times longer than the Roman Empire, just to give you some perspective. And so they had this huge edifice. It was the ruins of a city. And the people who lived in the shadow of the ruins of that city, descendants of the Assyrians, didn't remember whose city it was, because he asked. He's like, what are these ruins? And they're like, we don't know. And that was not many generations down the road. So when you remove preservation, when someone comes in and destroys your entire culture and it's gone, you forget who you are. And you're like, I don't. But then, of course, when you remove progress, you stagnate. And then there's the sinful versions of these. The sinful version of preservation is policing.
Right.
And
because this is the way it's always been.
Yes.
Yes.
And then the sinful version of progress is, just to keep it with P words, is like pyromania. It's like, let's burn it all down and start over, Right. And that leads you into unhealthy revolution and anarchy and things like that. And the police state leads you into totalitarianism and a lot of sinful forms of control.
Well, and you saying that, it makes me think on both extremes, you really lose the human element.
Yeah.
If you're trying to hang on to the past too hard, you're forgetting that people are fluid and liquid and moving. If you just push ahead to the future, you're forgetting that people have history and connections and stories and memories, and you're not acknowledging on either side that human element.
So these two good things that healthy cultures require, I think, are sort of the root of it, because we as humans, we don't like tension, we don't like ambiguity, and we don't like mystery. We don't like being between things. We want compartmentalization, and we want clarity, and we want explanation.
And we don't like change.
Yes, but that's not really how it works. So I think that's the root. These are good things. I also think that this is one of the infinite reasons why family is used as the number one metaphor for the church in the New Testament. Family is what Andy Crouch calls the building block of culture. And if you think about it, a family is an organism that keeps you connected to your past, directly to your past. You can't forget it because it's your family that you live in, but it's also a unit designed specifically to create new life and new generations. So I think in the New Testament metaphor of the family, we see God saying, like, look at how these fit together. This idea of preservation, connection to the past, and this idea of progress and gesturing towards the future. And you see Jesus do it all the time with the institutions of his day. He played both roles, right? Sometimes he's like, you've forgotten who you are. Don't you remember? And at other times, often in the same conversation, he's like, also, by the way, you added way too much. You need to, like, we need to go back. And so he's, on one hand, he's progressive, saying, like, come out of the past. And in other ways, he's saying, yeah, but you've got to reconnect to that foundation because you're just flailing about, so yeah.
So why do you think there appears to be, from my perspective as a Christian and as an artist, a tension between creative people and the church?
One aspect of that is that, like I said earlier, that institutions tend to be the preservers in a culture. And the church is not necessarily an institution. Again,
it probably shouldn't be,
Scripture
but it
talks
becomes
about it mostly
one.
as a family. But it becomes one over history. And there are some unique forces in American culture that, to be a church requires certain types of just licensing with the government to be considered a nonprofit, or just for when people give to you as an organization, and what role you're able to play in society. And that sort of just forces a type of institutionalism just to navigate culture as it is now. And through history, there have been different ways that institutionalism has arisen. And sometimes that's been good. In medieval ages, the institutional, lasting, generational nature of the church preserved a lot of culture during a lot of upheaval, the Black Plague, and a lot of war and a lot of destruction. But of course, there's a very negative side, which is like it just, institutions tend to, if they do change very slowly. And so the church often is sort of seen as being simultaneous or as being an organization, an institution. But really the church should sort of be playing in this pseudo individualistic institutional space. And so, but it's much easier. It's much easier to be an institution because it's got rules and you know what to expect.
Like a default almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the issue. On the other side, you have artists who are like, I have got this incandescent imagination for the future. I can see all the new things that need to happen, and can be very dismissive of the rest of the community, of traditions, of history, saying none of that matters because I have figured this out, So, this is where sin and human nature starts to get into those good things of preservation and progress and sort of start to pull them apart. And then another just very natural place where we get some separation here is the nature of newness. By its very nature, newness is something that most people don't understand because they haven't experienced it yet, because it's new. And so if you're in a profession that involves creating newness, you will often just be misunderstood or just not understood enough. It's hard to make a mental leap to imagine something that someone is telling you could be true, but you've never seen it. You know what I mean?
And fear comes into that too, doesn't it?
Fear comes into that, and you change. The number one fear after speaking in public.
Yes, which is so ironic.
Is moving and change, because it's just like it makes such a huge disruption to your life.
So, what do you tell an artist who says, I don't want to go to church, they don't understand me, or I can't connect? I grew up Christian, but I can't connect because I feel out of place in a church.
Every one of these conversations is a little bit different. And actually, I should mention before I get into this, I should mention one other dynamic that comes into play. And that is the conflation that often happens in people's minds and hearts between their parents and their church. Because we usually grow up in the church, we're brought there by our parents. And so a lot of times the way our parents view our art, we read that onto the way the church views our art without that necessarily being true. And so for a lot of people, it's really the relationship their parents have to what they're doing. And they sort of lump the church in with that, But there's some things I point out is that, you want to be seen as a unique individual by the church, but you are doing the opposite by lumping them all together and just saying the church doesn't get me. And then another thing is just the fact that churches are made of broken, sinful people, and what you want will never fully be realized on this side of history in the church. If you found a perfect church, you would ruin it by showing up because you're sinful. And so part of it is just sort of like artists are idealists, and they want the ideal version of things. But often that's not a realistic expectation. It doesn't allow for things like sinfulness and mistakes and misunderstandings. And so a lot of the conversation when I'm talking to an artist about that particular topic is about those sort of things. Like, look, it's just, people are just messy. All people are messy. And also you make sure that you're talking about a group of individuals and that you're not you're just saying like they're all one monolithic thing. And be careful. Are you confusing them with your parents? All the church at large with your parents.
Good point. So
Bezalel and Oholiab are often referred to in these kind of conversations because Bezalel, being the first person in the Old Testament to be filled with the Holy Spirit, was filled with the Holy Spirit to be given artistic gifts to build the tabernacle. And Oholiab was made his lieutenant. But what gets talked about a lot less is the fact that was paired with a teaching gift, that they were given the gift of art, but then that was paired with a gift to teach others how to see and think and do that. And so if you feel misunderstood by the church, part of the problem may be that you're only picking up half of the of the baton, maybe part of what you need to do is teach people how to see and feel and think and imagine in those ways. That these are very paired gifts. A woman named, a scholar named Maria Sachko Ciceri, and Maria, if you ever hear this and I butchered that, please forgive me. She wrote this essay called Empire Fantasy, The Rise and Fall of the Oxford School of Fantasy Literature. And she's talking primarily about Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who kind of created the fantasy genre as we know it. Mm-hmm. But what she points out is that possibly even more influential than that, and also what ensured that these things they were trying became something that more and more people became their own genres and streams of literature, is the fact that at the same time that they were creating Chronicles of Narnia and Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, they were also in charge of constructing the English curriculum at Oxford. And they constructed a curriculum that was based largely on medievalist fantasies, Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knights, and then even some slightly more progressive modern things like Paradise Lost or Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. And so they created this curriculum, which for the next 40 years, if you were an English student at Oxford, you were taught this is what good literature is.
You read all of those.
And if you look at all those writers who came in their wake, they're all using the same toolbox. And so that is part of why children's fantasy and fantasy as we understand them became so pervasive, is because they didn't just do it and show us it could be cool. They educated 40 years worth of people on that way of thinking. And of course, to give her essay its due, there are positives and negatives about that. There can be some pretty substantial negatives about that. But I've been thinking about that a lot, and about Bezalel and Oholiab and this connection between teaching and arts.
And creativity. That is so interesting, because I think I had a fabulous pastor for years who wanted to get better at being a pastor. Mm-hmm. And he had been listening to a lot of stories by Garrison Keillor. So he actually tracked down Garrison Keillor and said, may I spend 3 days with you and you teach me how to tell stories so that I can use my teaching platform in a more creative storytelling way. So he was bringing together his church preaching and the art of storytelling. Spent 3 days with him, changed his life. His success as a pastor, if you say success, his growth just grew amazingly. And he felt like it was a combination of the preaching and teaching and art and storytelling together. And I found that fascinating.
Yes. And that what that brings up is the other side of this coin, right? Churches are often wired as teaching institutions, right? It's Sunday school. Mm-hmm. Preaching, lecturing, teaching tend to be anchor practices in most churches in North America. As a church, you were built and you have this long history and experience of teaching. So how can you bring your teaching gift and connect it to the arts? Can you teach your people about just the history of art, maybe, or just the history of the art in the church, which provides a lot of understanding of what's actually going on now to this day. It's stuff that goes all the way back to like the 3rd century. Mm-hmm. These same conversations that pop up over and over again. But how can the church, as this teaching organization, this teaching historical legacy, open people's eyes to the possibilities of newness and the arts and imagination and things like that?
That's the end of part 1 of our 2-part series with Caleb Monroe. Be sure to listen to part 2 coming up. You don't want to miss Caleb's insights into the relationship between the church and Hollywood. This is Karen Covell with the Hollywood Changemakers Podcast.